the Windows Server Firewall. Since pretty much everyone you know owns one or more computers nowadays, it stands to reason that security is always a pretty hot topic. And that's because we all rely on our computers to store our sensitive information, such as our social security numbers, our passwords, our bank account information, credit card details, and the list goes on. Now, I'm absolutely certain that you guys don't want people, whether they're malicious or otherwise, to sneak onto your computer and take a look at, or delete, or steal your personal information. I know I don't, and that's why a firewall's so important. But when it comes to your servers, do you still need a firewall? After all, isn't your network's firewall protecting the network? Well, yeah, it should be protecting your network, but there's a lot more to security than stopping the bad guys at the perimeter of your network. A lot of the bad stuff comes from within your network, and that's why each and every Microsoft workstation and server now comes with its own firewall, so you can lock it down tight and hopefully prevent the bad guys from gaining access to the confidential data you have on your server. Now, in the unlikely event that some of you don't know what a firewall is, or more specifically what the Windows firewall is, it's just a bit of software that sits between your computer and external networks, controlling what comes in and what goes out. Now, before you get started, be aware that the Windows 2008 firewall is running by default when you first install Windows 2008, so there's really nothing to do to get it going, but there is most likely some sort of configuration you'll want to do so that it runs right. But if for some reason you're unable to launch the firewall, just make sure that the firewall service is running. So let's go and check that now. We'll go and click on Start, and we'll choose Administrative Tools, and down nearer to the bottom we're going to select the Services console. Now if we scroll down near to the bottom of this console, we'll be looking for the Windows Firewall service, which should be started, and it is, and it also should be set to automatically start when Windows Server 2008 starts, so just make sure that it is in fact started before you proceed. Alright, well let's go and close down this console now, and we'll move on and we'll click Start, and firstly we're going to go and launch the Control Panel, and we'll double click on the Windows Firewall icon here at the bottom, and straight away we're presented with this big red warning telling us that our firewall isn't using the recommended settings. However, that aside, you can see that by default our Windows Firewall is on, and it tells you that right here, the Windows Firewall is on. Any inbound connections will be blocked unless we create a rule which will make an exception. We're not going to display any messages if we do block a program. And finally, the network location is set to a domain network. Now, it's this network location bit here. That's the area of concern when it comes to this big red message here telling us that our firewall isn't configured to Microsoft's liking. The truth is though, for normal server operation you probably won't have to change anything at all, since this network location feature isn't likely to be changed from our domain network profile to anything else. But we'll get around to that in a moment after we've taken a look at the options we have here. Now you note here on this window we've got a few hyperlinks. We've got to change settings here up the top. We can turn Windows Firewall on or off, or allow a program through the Windows Firewall. The truth is that almost all of them are going to take you to the same place, and that's to this window here with these three tabs. The only difference with clicking these links here is where on this particular window you'll end up landing on. So let's take a quick look at these three tabs here. Although advanced users really won't spend much time in this window, they're going to use a different console altogether, but we'll get to that in a moment. So the first tab we have here is a general tab, and we can see that the default setting is to have our Windows Firewall on and active, and it's going to block any incoming connections to your server except for those that are listed on the exceptions tab, which we'll see in a moment. But if you want to block absolutely everything, you can choose the second option here, which is the most secure option, but it will prevent some things like file sharing, for example, from working properly, since people will be no longer able to connect to this server. Now finally, down the bottom here we can turn the firewall off, and that's definitely not recommended. But if you are running another firewall, or perhaps you're sitting behind a corporate firewall like ISA server, then you might want to turn it off, and you can do that here if you like, but it's still a good idea to leave it on anyway, even if you are running behind a corporate firewall, since any internal malicious activity within your network, that can still cause your server damage, and your corporate facing internet firewall isn't going to protect you from that, but Windows Firewall running on your local server can. The next tab we have at the top here is the exceptions tab, and the applications listed down here in this window with a tick will all be able to connect through to our 2008 server, but the ones that are unchecked will not. If you have a program you want to be able to have other people connect to your server to use, and a good example of that might be something like remote desktop, then you can scroll down, locate the application, and then place a check in the box next to its name. However, if you have another application that isn't listed here and you want to allow access to that one, it's as simple as clicking on the Add Program button. And if it's in the list here, you can select it. If it's not, click on the Browse button and then just navigate to the program's executable itself. Now, once you've added it to the list, simply make sure you have a check in the box next to the program, and that's it. Now, if you want to place further restrictions on who can connect to your application, we'll click on Add Program again, and we'll select the program from the list, and then we'll click on the Change Scope button. Now, from here you can choose to allow any computer to connect to your server to access the specified application, and that's the default. You can change this for only people on the subnet that you're on, or you can enter in a specific IP address, or multiple if you like, separating each IP address with a comma. Now, that's not a bad method of further restricting access to an application within your company, but be aware that it might also make troubleshooting access problems later on a little more difficult, since it's not so likely that checking your Windows Firewall rules is going to be one of the first things you think of later on. Now, we could also add ports as well, and we can enter in the name and the port number and whether that's using TCP or UDP. And again, on the Change Scope button, like when we looked at adding a program a moment ago, we could limit this to incoming connections to all computers, only those on our subnet or a custom list. Now, finally, on the Advanced tab, we can set which network adapters this firewall will protect. Now, since I only have one network card inside this server, we only have the single choice here, but if you've got two or more, then those additional network cards will be listed here. Now, what we've just looked at is the Windows Firewall in its most basic form, and most people probably won't venture past this point, as most of the things they'll ever need to do, they can do from this console. However, I did allude to a more advanced console a little while ago in this video, and people like you that are listening to this video now are probably going to want to use this console, since it provides you with a much more granular control over the firewall. So we'll close this one down and we'll click on Start. We'll go to Administrative Tools, and right down the bottom here you can see Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. So we're going to fire up that console. And the first thing you'll probably notice about this console is it's one of the new three-paned ones that we're seeing Microsoft implement in their newer operating systems. And right bang in the middle of the console, we've got a summary here of what our system is currently configured with. And remember when we launched the control panel version of the Windows Firewall, it gave us that big red message? Well, right here's why. In the Windows Firewall, we have three potential profiles we could be using. Although, since this is a server and not a client machine like Windows Vista, it's likely that we're really ever going to use only one of these three profiles, and that's the domain profile at the top here. Now, some of you might recall though, when you first installed Windows 2008 or even Windows Vista, that it asked you where you'd be using the server or computer. It asked you whether it was part of a business or a home or a public network. Well, the reason it did that was so it could apply one of these three firewall profiles, which can have different security rules applied to them. Now, this is good, since if the server is picked up and moved around and joins new networks, then new settings can be applied automatically. Like I said though, it's not likely that with a server you're going to pick it up and use it on some wireless hotspot. That's more likely to be client operating system territory, but that's what these profiles are for. So at the top here we can see that for our domain profile, firstly this is the active profile. This is the one that's currently protecting this server right now, and for this profile the Windows firewall is on. Inbound connections that don't match any rules are going to be blocked, so unless we create a rule to allow them, they'll be blocked. And outbound connections are allowed unless we explicitly create a rule to block them, which I might add we will do later on in this video. Now for the next profile, the private profile, all of our configuration options are identical to our domain profile, but the important thing to understand here is that we're not using this profile at all. Only if we switch over to this profile do these settings really matter at all. Now the final option down here is the public profile, and this is designed to kick in when our server is connected to a public network. And you can see that by default in this profile the firewall's turned off. Now this is the reason that the control panel firewall dialog box was complaining. So let's go and turn the firewall on for this profile, since in all honesty if you ever needed a firewall, it's for when you connect to a public network. I mean, you should have one on all the time regardless, but definitely when you connect to public networks. So we're going to click on this hyperlink here, Windows Firewall Properties, and here we'll be able to specify how we want our firewall to behave if this computer or server is connected to a domain, a private location, for example at home, or in a public location such as a wireless network or at the library. Now all three of these tabs are exactly the same, but the configuration options you choose might be different to compensate for the different threat levels you'll face when connecting through different networks. For example, if we're joined to a corporate domain, you'd expect that you'd be more secure behind the corporate firewall, and as such you might be able to work with a little bit less security. Whereas at a public location, you'd want to lock things down quick sharp. So we'll select our public profile here, and in any of these profiles you can set the firewall state to be on or off. So since this is off, we're going to choose to set it to on, and we'll click apply. And if we quickly go back to our control panel firewall here, you'll see that our red message is now changed to green, and Microsoft is now happy with our configuration choices. But in my opinion, it should have shipped with this defaulted anyway, but hey, there's no use complaining, it's not much work to turn it on anyway. Alright, well back to our advanced console though, let's go and take a look at what other options we have here, because they are important to understand. At the top here we've got our inbound connections and outbound connections, and we can allow or block these connections. Incoming connections, of course, are people that are trying to connect to this server, and outgoing is this server trying to connect somewhere else. Now under our settings heading, if we click on the customize button, we can configure the firewall to display a notification message whenever a program is blocked from receiving an inbound connection coming into this server. And by default you can see this is turned off. Now we can also allow a unicast response to a multicast or broadcast request, and that's set to yes, which is the default. But what does this mean? Well, to understand this we really need to understand what unicast, multicast and broadcast means. And the simple explanation is that unicast is just one computer sending data out to another computer directly. So two computers, they're talking to each other. Multicast can be many computers sending out data to many other computers. And broadcast is one computer sending data out to many computers. So by default, this setting here just means that we're going to allow a single computer to respond to our computer when we either initiate a multicast or a broadcast. Now, even though this rule is set to yes to allow this, it'll only allow a response to be accepted if it comes back within 3 seconds. Now, if it takes longer than this, the response is always going to be blocked. and the only exception to this rule is DHCP replies, which are always allowed through. Of course, you could set this to no, and then block all replies if you like. Finally, right down the bottom here, we can't change these options here for rule merging since they all relate to group policy, and we'll need to edit these through the group policy editor. Alright, well our final option here is to configure logging, and here we can set the path to our log, which defaults to going into our Windows System 32 directory in a folder called log files, firewall, and a name of pfirewall log, but you can certainly change that if you like. The default size of this log up here is going to be 4 meg, and we won't be logging any drop packets or any successful connections, but again, you can certainly change any of these values if you like, and log this sort of information should you require it. Now these other two tabs are exactly the same, so we'll move on to our IPsec settings tab, which is where we can decide how IPsec should be handled on our Windows 2008 server. Now, we're not going to run through these now since IPsec is really a discussion in its own right, and we're definitely going to cover that in a later video. But if we click on the Customize button here, you can see from this window that everything here is using the default settings for the key exchange, the data protection, and the authentication method. And if you're wondering what these default values actually are, we could click on this "What are the default values" hyperlink down the bottom, which is appropriately named there, and you'll get a complete listing here of all of these defaults, which you can certainly change if you like. So we're not going to talk any more about these now. Again, IPsec is something we will cover in a separate video. Now the other option we have here is to exempt pings from IPsec. Now as you can see, the default here is set to no, or to not exempt ICMP packets from being encrypted. Now, whilst leaving this default setting at no is definitely the best option right now under normal working conditions, but if you're experiencing IPsec problems and you're troubleshooting, I'd definitely be setting this to yes, since it's most likely that one of the first things you're going to want to try to do when you can't get to a remote host is to try and ping the device you're trying to connect to. And by setting this to yes, it'll allow ping traffic to remain unencrypted, which will help you to decide if there's really a network problem or some other reason why the remote host can't be contacted, or whether in fact you do need to take a look at IPsec itself as a cause of the problem. Alright, well let's move on and we'll take a look at how we can configure inbound and outbound rules for our firewall, since this is where we have real power and flexibility within our Windows firewall. Now remember that inbound rules are rules that govern communication coming into your server, people from the outside connecting to this machine. And outbound is exactly the opposite. It's communication going from this server to other machines or networks. So up here in the left-hand side, if we select inbound rules, in the middle of our console, you can see we've got a long list of pre-configured inbound rules that already come built into the Windows firewall, and instantly you can see here through this list if they're active or not active, as active rules have a green tick icon here, and those that are currently inactive show the same icon but in a grey colour. So to enable or disable rules is as simple as selecting a rule here, and we can right click on it and choose to disable it. Or over on the right in the actions menu, we've got the same option there. Now if we select a disabled rule and we right click on that one, we've got the option there to enable it, and again over here in the right in the actions pane. Now you'll note we can also delete a rule if we no longer require it, but personally I'd err on the side of caution here, since it's probably better to simply disable the rule rather than delete it, unless you're absolutely certain that you won't ever need it again. Now finally, we can also edit the properties of an existing rule as well. Now if you do choose to edit an existing rule, just be aware that there are certain properties you probably won't be able to change, and if we click on the Protocols and Ports tab, you'll see here that these fields are already set and they can't be changed. So let's go and cancel this, and let's go and create a rule of our own. Now when we go to create a rule, we'll first need to decide if it's an inbound or an outbound rule that we want to create. If it's inbound, you'll need to make sure that you have inbound rules selected on the left-hand side of the console. If it's outbound, you'll need to make sure that you have outbound selected. So we'll select an outbound rule since I already have that highlighted here. So we're going to right click and choose new rule, or we could do that over here in the actions menu as well. Either way is going to open up our new rule wizard. And firstly, we're going to need to decide what type of rule we want to create. Do we want to configure our firewall for a specific program, a port? Do we want to create a rule that targets a predefined Windows feature, or create a custom rule? Now you'll notice that if we run down here and select these, on the left hand side here, the steps required to configure each of these rules changes. So you see that on the left hand side as I'm clicking through these, the options, the steps down on the left hand side continually change. Now in the majority of cases with these rules, you'll be creating program or port rules, since it's most likely that you've got a specific program you want to allow or prevent people from using, or you may have a program that requires a specific port to be open. Now I did mention this earlier in this video that we'd be using a rule to lock down this server a little bit more, since you might recall that the default setting of our firewall is to allow all outbound communication. Now that's fine really, since in most cases the only issue with having unrestricted outbound communication is that if for some reason this server does get infected with some malicious code, then by not blocking outbound communication, there's a possibility that the malicious code could send out data from this machine. And secondly, allowing full outbound communications on a server anyway isn't a very good idea. Now I know, look, I've been in a situation myself where you're doing some work on a corporate server and you need access to the internet to download a patch or maybe search for a solution to a problem. And right here on the server is that icon for Internet Explorer. So why not just give it a click and do what you have to do? And that's a problem right there. It's so easy for a server to become infected by visiting websites that have malicious code execution type things happening. So the general rule is you never browse the web from your servers. Now, some of you might already have implemented this rule and you're actively enforcing it. And some of you might not yet be doing that. But all of you should be. And that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to create a rule that stops Internet Explorer code when you launch it from this server. So as a quick test, let's go and fire up Internet Explorer. And we'll go and head off to winstructor.com. And there you can see that we do in fact have internet access here. So let's go and kill the fun for everyone. We're going to create a program rule here since we want to block Internet Explorer access. Of course, another option would be to block outbound communications on port 80. But we'll go with the program rule here for now. We'll click Next. Now we'll want to click on the Browse button and head off and locate the executable file for Internet Explorer, which we're going to find on our C drive, Program Files, Internet Explorer, and we're going to select iexplore.exe, which is the full file name, and we'll click Open, and then we'll click Next. Now our options here are to allow the connection, which we don't want to do. We can allow the connection if it's a secure connection using IPsec, or we can block the connection. Now, we don't want people using IE to browse the net on this machine, so we're going to choose Block and click Next. Now, when does this rule apply? When we're connected to our domain profile, private and public. And we've talked a little bit about profiles earlier in this video, so I'm going to leave the default here at all of them, and we'll click Next. And the last thing we'll need to do is give this rule a name and an optional description. So I'm just going to say block IE. And we'll click Finish. Now right up the top here of our outbound rules list, there's our new rule. It's enabled and it's already working. So now if we go back to Internet Explorer and we'll attempt to refresh this page. You can see that it's not getting there. We could try another website. We'll try Google, and that won't work either. In fact, nothing will work, and that's exactly the point. We've blocked all access to the outside world using Internet Explorer, something we should never allow from a server anyway. Now that's great. It works as expected, but if you've got many servers in your company, which you probably do, you'll want to use group policy to roll out this sort of change to all servers. You won't want to do it manually for each one as I've just done. So since I'm on a domain controller right now, I'm going to close IE and we'll click on Start, Administrative Tools, and we'll launch the Group Policy Management Console. Now we'll go and expand our forest, then domains, then my domain, winstructorlab.com. And for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to edit our default domain policy here. But in your company, you'll most likely have a specific OU just for your servers, or perhaps you could create a policy and use a WMI filter to only target specific machines, for example servers of course, and target them that way. Now whatever method you use, you'll just need to select your policy, right click, and then choose Edit. Under our computer configuration heading, we're going to expand Policies. Then we'll expand Windows Settings, Security Settings. We'll expand Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. And then we'll expand Windows Firewall with Advanced Security again. And then we'll need to select the appropriate container. In this case, it's going to be an outbound rule. Now we'll right click and we'll choose a new rule. And from here, the process is the same as just before. You just need to run through the wizard again and create the rule exactly like we did a moment ago, just as you would for a single machine, except by creating the rule here with a policy, we'll be applying it to multiple servers, not just this one. So every server or computer that applies this policy will get this rule. Now, let's just cancel this for now, because whilst I'm here, it's worth clicking on this Windows Firewall with Advanced Security link, because in the right hand side of the console you're going to see our 3 profiles that we talked about earlier. Now you can also configure these things here as well. So if we click on the Windows Firewall Properties hyperlink, and like you've already seen, we're able to configure the firewall state for our various profiles. And you'll recall at the start of this video we saw that the public profile didn't have the firewall turned on. Well, you can set that to be on by default. And as soon as a new computer applies your policy, it's going to turn that firewall on, and that's a really good idea. So you'll want to click on each of these tabs and set the firewall to be on, and at the very least, you'll want it on, actively blocking inbound connections. So just so we're clear, the firewall state will need to be set to on. The inbound connections should be set to block, and you're going to want to do this for all 3 profiles. Now once you've done that, you can click OK. Alright, well moving on, we'll head off back to our firewall console. And over on the left hand side of the console, the next option we have here is Connection Security Rules, which are used so that 2 computers can authenticate with each other using IPsec before any sort of communication takes place. So why is this important? Well, because although the firewall can allow or block communications from occurring, it doesn't secure any traffic. But do be aware that just because you might create a connection security rule to allow 2 computers to talk to each other securely, if the firewall isn't configured to allow traffic to or from the remote computer, then it simply won't work. So if you create a connection security rule and things aren't working as planned, then check to see that the firewall itself is in fact allowing traffic. So to create a new connection security rule, we'll click on New Rule, and this starts up another wizard similar to the previous one. The first type of connection security rule we've got here is an isolation rule, which we can use to restrict connections based on authentication criteria, such as whether they're a member of our domain or not, or computers on the internet, as well as things like the health of the computer, which basically means if they're applying the correct software updates. Now we could use authentication exemption, which means don't worry about authenticating with the other computer or range of computers, and this is useful for things like domain controllers and DHCP servers, so we could exclude them from the extra overhead of an authentication process. Now next we have server-to-server authentication, which we can use to authenticate between two computers, and don't pay any attention to the fact that it says server-to-server here. It's simply used when you want two computers to authenticate, or two groups of computers, or two subnets. Now next we have tunnel, and this is used for two computers that want to communicate through a tunnel, such as over a VPN or IPsec tunnel. And finally we can create a custom connection security rule. So let's choose a custom one. We'll click Next. And the first thing we'll need to do here is to define both endpoint computers. So here we can specify which computers are going to be talking to which computers. Now the default, as you can see, is for any IP addresses talking to any IP addresses, but you could change that to a specific IP address if you like by choosing these IP addresses and then clicking Add. And from this window you can enter in a single IP address or a range of IP addresses, or you could choose a predefined set of computers from this list here, such as our Wins DHCP and DNS servers, our default gateway, or any computers from the local subnet. Now, if you do want to further restrict this rule to only a specific interface on your computer, we can click on the Customize button, and here you can choose from the local area network, remote access, or any wireless interfaces that you might have. Alright, well, I'm going to leave the default here at any IP address. We'll click Next. Alright, now we'll need to define what sort of authentication needs to occur between these two computers, if any, for communication to be able to take place. Now we could request authentication, but if it's not available, such as the remote computer doesn't support it, then we'll connect anyway without authenticating. We could choose to require authentication for any communications coming into our machine, but only request it when we make the outbound connection. And by the way, if you don't fully understand the difference between requesting and requiring authentication, when we request it, we're going to make all attempts to authenticate first, but if it fails, we're going to connect anyway. When we require authentication and it fails, the connection will be dropped. So requiring authentication is much more secure, as it simply won't work if authentication fails. But of course, if either computer doesn't support it, or there's a problem with the authentication process, then the communication won't be established. So next, on that basis, we can require authentication for inbound and outbound connections, and of course that's the most secure. And finally, we can choose not to have any authentication at all. So I'm going to leave the default here, which is to request authentication. We'll click Next, and then we'll be able to set what sort of authentication we want to use. Now the default is to use the default authentication method, which is rather helpful if you don't know what the defaults are. Now these defaults are found in the profile properties of your firewall, and in a moment I'll show you where they're found. Now the remaining choices here we have for restricting communications to only authenticated users and computers, as long as they belong to a domain or by using a certificate. Now down the bottom here we have some advanced options. If we check this button and click on the Customize button here, we're able to create custom first and second authentication methods. Now the difference between our first and our second authentication method is concerned with the initial negotiations for the computer to authenticate, and the second here is when the user logged onto the computer needs to authenticate. So here we're able to choose what method we want to use for each phase of authentication, and we can even make them optional. So for argument's sake, we'll choose the Add button here for the first authentication method, and we can choose from Kerberos, NTLM version 2, a certificate, or a pre-shared key, which as it says isn't recommended since the key is stored in plain text. So let's choose Kerberos, which is the default. We'll click OK, and we'll click Add again, and we'll add in the second one, NTLM, and we'll click OK again. Now what's going to happen here is that for our first authentication method, we're going to try and use Kerberos version 5. Now if that fails, we'll move on and attempt to use the next method in the list, which is NTLM version 2, and so forth until they're all tried. Now if at this point none of them work, the connection itself is going to fail unless we check this box at the bottom to say that this authentication method is optional. But on the second authentication method on this side of the window, the process is the same. However, here we're concerned with user authentication. So we'll click Add here, and again we've got the same options pretty much, except these pertain to users and not computers. Alright, now once you've made your selections, we'll simply click OK, and we're ready to go. But do be aware that if you do click this second authentication is optional box, and you've already configured the first one to be optional, then basically you've just turned authentication off. Since if all of the first authentication methods fail, and the second ones fail, the connection of course will succeed without any regard to what you've set in these boxes here. Now, down the bottom of this window here, you'll see this hyperlink, what are the default values. If we click that again, you're going to see all of the values that will be used when we leave the default values checked. So it's not plainly obvious to people when they run through this wizard, but at least you know where to find those values. Alright, well, let's close this now. And I'm just going to set this back to the default and we'll click Next. Now we can apply this to any of these three profiles, and we've seen this all before. They're all checked by default. We'll leave that as it is. We'll click Next. And we'll need to give our new connection security rule a name. I'll give it a name of test here. We can also give it an optional description. I won't bother about that now. We'll just click Finish. Okay, well there's our new rule. It's now enabled and running. And if we right click on it, we could choose to edit the properties if we want to change something. And we can also delete and disable this rule. Alright, over here on the left, the next item we have in our firewall console is monitoring. And as you've probably guessed, this lets us monitor our firewall's inbound and outbound rules and connection security rules. But it won't let you monitor IPsec policies that have been created using the IPsec policy snap-in. So bear that in mind if you come in here and you can't find what you're looking for. So in the middle of this window here, you can see an overview of our firewall settings. We can see that the firewall is on. Inbound connections that don't match any rules are going to be blocked. Outbound connections will be allowed unless we've explicitly created a rule to block them, and so on. And if we expand monitoring and choose firewall, this is going to show us all the rules that are currently enabled on our firewall, both inbound and outbound. Connection security rules here shows us all connection security rules are enabled on our firewall. And finally, under security associations, we'll be able to see any connections that are currently in place with other computers in either main mode or quick mode. And the discussion of main mode and quick mode authentication is really an entire discussion in itself, but I'll give you a quick short version. Main mode is the first phase of negotiating authentication and uses an internet key exchange to establish a secure channel for communication. Quick mode, though, is not really considered to be a complete exchange since it relies on a main mode exchange first. But either way, inside these folders, you'll see your main and quick mode security associations. Now, something else I want to make clear regarding the rules on our firewall is that when you take a look through this predefined list of rules that come inbuilt with Windows 2008, even though some of them are enabled and some of them are disabled, these rules can change when you perform other configuration tasks outside of the firewall itself. For example, if we scroll down our inbound rules here a little bit, you're going to notice things like file and printer sharing is turned on. We'll see other things like remote desktop, that's also turned on. So, if we quickly go and click on Start and we'll right click on our computer and choose Properties and go to the Advanced System Settings and then the Remote tab, you can see that we're currently allowing remote desktop connections, so let's turn that off. We'll choose to not allow them and we'll click Apply. And now we'll go back to our firewall and we'll right click and refresh this list. Now if we scroll down, you'll see that this rule has now been disabled outside of the actual firewall console. So bear that in mind, there are applications and tools outside of the firewall console itself that of course are going to make changes in here. Now, before we wrap up this video here, the final thing I want to touch on is how to control the Windows firewall from the command prompt. But in many cases, you probably won't even touch the command prompt for configuring your firewall, but if you do need to modify the Windows firewall on a lot of systems, you're going to find that the command prompt is much faster than the GUI, so it's worth knowing how to get started. So we're going to click on Start, and we'll open up a command prompt. And just so I've got a bit more line to work with, I'm going to change to the root of my C drive. Alright, well, the command that we're looking for is the netsh command, followed by the firewall context. And if you add a /question after this command and you hit enter, you can see all of the available options you have. We can add and delete firewall configuration rules. We can show the firewall configuration and so forth. So let's use our netsh command to add a new rule to our firewall. So we'll use the add option, and if we type a /question again, you can see we've got two options here. We can add a program or a port to our configuration. So let's use the port option. So we'll need to add in port opening. And again, if we add a /question, you can see what other command options we have. So let's scroll back up our output here, and we can see the syntax required for adding in things like ports, protocols, a name for our rule, the scope, and so forth. So we'll need to define the protocol, the port, and a name for our rule. But I will point out, if we scroll back up, that under our port mode, we have an option to enable or disable communications. This setting is optional, so if we don't explicitly define it in our command line, then it will take the default, which is to enable this rule to communicate through the firewall. Now, for the scope, the default here is to allow all traffic to be allowed through the firewall. Now, the addresses option is also optional, and by default, if we don't change it, then this command is only going to affect the profile that we're currently using. Alright, so let's go back down to the bottom here, and we're going to add in the TCP port 80 for argument's sake, and I'm going to give this a name of HTTP test. Alright, we'll hit enter, and we can see the OK prompt indicating that our command worked fine. So let's go back to our console here, and we'll refresh this list. And if we scroll back up to the top, you can see our test rule that we just created. Now let's right click on this rule and choose Properties, and we can see this rule is enabled. The default action is to allow communication to take place. On the Protocols and Ports tab, we can see port 80. On the Scope tab, this will be set to any IP addresses, and on the Advanced tab, you can see that the only profile being affected was the domain profile, which is the current profile that's being used on this server. Now, if we go back to our command prompt, the other thing I should mention that there also is an advanced firewall option to this netsh command. So if we type in netsh followed by adv firewall and type in a /question, you can see that we've got a bunch more options relating to the advanced firewall, and you can use this to configure global settings or export the policy of your firewall and so on. So whilst this isn't intended to be a video detailing every conceivable option you have with the netsh firewall or the advanced firewall commands, I just wanted to throw this in just to show you that you can in fact manipulate the Windows firewall from the command prompt. And since these netsh firewall commands do have inbuilt help, by simply typing in the /question after everything, you shouldn't get stuck if you take a look at this later on. In this video, we've talked about the Windows Server 2008 firewall and seen just how easy it is to configure the firewall to allow or block ports, applications and services from accessing your server. Now, in today's digital age, there's no server that should ever be running without a firewall, and thankfully the included firewall with Windows Server 2008 is very reliable and it's really easy to configure. So we hope you enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for watching.